The wind did not blow in the Wyoming territory so much as it scoured. It was a living, breathing malice that stripped the paint from the sides of buildings and the hope from the eyes of men. It carried the taste of alkali dust and the scent of sagebrush crushed under the hooves of 1,000 cattle. On this particular afternoon in the late spring of 1878, the wind seemed determined to push the rattling stagecoach off the narrow trail and into the dry wash that ran alongside it like a jagged scar in the earth. Inside the coach, the air was hot and thick with the smell of old leather and unwashed bodies. Nora Gallagher sat squeezed into the corner, her spine pressed against the vibrating wood. She gripped the handle of her small, worn carpet bag with such ferocity that her knuckles had turned the color of old bone. Her fingers were raw, the skin chapped from days of travel and the nervous habit of rubbing her thumb against the rough fabric of her skirt. She looked out the window, but she did not see the vast, terrifying emptiness of the plains or the distant peaks of the mountains that rose up like the teeth of a saw blade against the blue sky. The landscape was too big, too open. It made her feel small, like a speck of dust waiting to be blown away. Instead of the horizon, her mind kept dragging her back to the cramped, velvet-draped rooms of the town she had fled 3 weeks ago. The memory came in flashes, sharp and stinging like a slap. She could smell the stale cigar smoke and the cloying scent of cheap lavender water. She could feel the heavy hand of Silas Hargrove on her shoulder, his fingers digging into her flesh through the thin cotton of her dress. "You are a pretty thing, Nora," Silas had said, his voice smooth like oil on water. And pretty things cost money to keep. She remembered the way the light from the gas lamps distorted the faces of the men in the saloon back east, turning them into grotesque masks of hunger and greed. She remembered the sewing needle she had wielded for 12 hours a day, stitching lace onto the gowns of the women who worked the upstairs rooms, until Silas decided that her fingers were not her most valuable asset. The panic rose in her throat, tasting of bile. She remembered the night she overheard him in his office, the door left slightly ajar. He was speaking to the sheriff of that coal-stained town, laughing about a contract, a piece of paper that he claimed made her his property, a debt inherited from a father she barely remembered, twisted by interest and lies until it was a chain she could never break. "She belongs to me," Silas had said, lock, stock, and barrel. That was the night she ran. She had taken nothing but the carpet bag and the clothes on her back, slipping out into the rainy alleyway while the saloon piano pounded out a cheerful tune that masked the sound of her sobbing breath. The stagecoach hit a rut, jolting Nora back to the present. The driver shouted something unintelligible at the horses, a string of curses that was whipped away by the wind before it could fully reach the passengers. Dawn Creek appeared on the horizon not as a sanctuary, but as a blemish on the pristine cruelty of the land. It was a collection of gray, weathered buildings clustered together as if for warmth, surrounded by a sea of brown grass. As the coach slowed, rolling down the main street, Nora saw the town for what it was, a place of dust, wind, and hard people. The coach groaned to a halt in front of the station. Nora waited until the other passengers, 2 somber men in suits and a woman with a crying baby, had disembarked. She stepped down into the dirt, her legs trembling from the long journey. The smell of the town hit her instantly, a pungent mix of horse manure, wet sawdust, and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey drifting from the open doors of the saloon across the street. The wind tugged at her bonnet, threatening to tear it loose. She stood by her bag, feeling the weight of eyes upon her. Men loitering on the porch of the general store stopped their conversation to stare. It was not the appreciative stare of a suitor, nor the polite glance of a passer-by. It was an assessing look. They were weighing her, judging her worth, wondering what tragedy or scandal had washed her up on their shore like driftwood. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of a dry goods store paused, leaning on her broom. Her eyes were hard, narrowed against the sun and the presence of a stranger. She looked Nora up and down, taking in the frayed hem of her dress and the nervous way she held her hands. The woman turned her head and spat onto the dirt, then went back to sweeping. Nora lowered her head. the old instinct to hide taking over. "Keep your head down," she told herself. "Swallow the silence." She picked up her bag and walked toward the sign that swung creaking in the wind. Mrs. Larkin's boarding house. Mrs. Larkin was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her face with it. She stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She looked at Nora with eyes that had seen every kind of hardship the frontier could offer and had long ago decided to stop caring about most of them. "I can pay for a week," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. She fumbled in her bag, producing a few crumpled bills. "And I can work, I can sew, I can clean. I am not afraid of hard work. Ma'am, Mrs." Larkin took the money, counting it slowly. She looked at Nora's hands, noting the calluses and the needle pricks. "We serve breakfast at 6 and supper at 6, Mrs., Larkin said, her tone flat. "You miss it. You do not eat. I need the linens washed on Mondays and the floor scrubbed on Thursdays. If you cause trouble, you are out. If men come looking for you and break my door, you pay for the door. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. The room Mrs. Larkin gave her was small, tucked under the eaves at the back of the house. It held a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the alley and the endless plains beyond. It was bleak, but it had a lock on the door. For the first time in weeks, Nora turned a key and felt a sliver of air enter her lungs. But safety was a fleeting illusion in Dawn Creek. In the days that followed, Nora learned that a woman alone was an affront to the natural order of the town. When she went to the general store to buy thread, conversation died as soon as she entered. The silence that followed her was heavy, suffocating. She could hear the whispers behind her back. "Who is she? Running from a husband, I wager, or the law? She has the look of a saloon girl, don't you think?" Nora kept her eyes on the floorboards. She bought her thread and hurried back to the boarding house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sewed until her eyes burned, mending shirts for the miners and drovers who passed through, taking in laundry that left her knuckles raw and bleeding. She carried hot meals to the stables for the hustlers, walking quickly with her gaze fixed on her boots, trying to make herself invisible. But she could feel the loneliness settling into her bones, cold and heavy like damp sand. She was surrounded by people, yet she had never been more alone. 2 days after Nora arrived, a lone rider appeared on the ridge to the south. Eli Carson let his horse pick its way down the rocky slope. The animal was tired, its coat matted with sweat and dust, its head low. Eli felt much the same. He had been in the saddle for 3 weeks, drifting north from the border, trying to outrun memories that were faster than any horse. He was a man in his 30s, though the sun and the wind had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. A scar ran from his left ear down to his jawline, a jagged white souvenir from a knife fight in a Tucson cantina he wished he could forget. He wore a faded duster and a hat that had lost its shape years ago. Eli shifted in the saddle, trying to ease the ache in his lower back. He looked at the town of Dawn Creek sprawled out below him. It looked like a scab on the land. He had no love for towns. Towns meant people, and people meant questions. People meant trouble. But his horse needed grain and rest, and his own pockets were empty. He needed a few weeks of wages, enough to buy supplies and move on. He always moved on. Staying meant letting the ghosts catch up. He closed his eyes for a second, and the image was there, waiting for him. The red splatter of blood on pristine white snow. The sound of a woman screaming in a burning barn. The weight of the Colt revolver in his hand, hot from firing. He had killed men. Some of them deserved it. Some of them, he wasn't so sure. He had been a soldier, then a lawman, then a hired gun for cattle barons who wanted problems solved without the interference of a judge. He had solved their problems, and in doing so, he had become a problem himself. He opened his eyes and pushed the memories back into the dark box in his mind where he kept them. He nudged his horse forward. Eli rode into Dawn Creek with the wary posture of a wolf entering a strange pack's territory. He kept his hands visible, away from the gun at his hip. He ignored the stares of the loafers on the boardwalks. He rode straight to the livery stable, paid the boy his last few coins to care for the horse, and walked toward the largest structure that wasn't a saloon. The McCready Ranch headquarters was a sprawling operation just on the edge of town. McCready was a hard man with a face like tanned leather, but he was known to pay on time and not ask about a man's past as long as he could work. Eli found the foreman by the corral. The conversation was short. "Can you ride?" the foreman asked. Eli nodded. "Can you rope?" Eli nodded again. "Any trouble with the law following you?" Eli paused. "Not that I know of," he said. "The foreman spat tobacco juice into the dust. Bunkhouse is round back. We ride out at dawn. Pay is $30 a month and found, don't start fights. And don't get drunk on a work night." Eli took the job. He stowed his gear in the bunkhouse, claiming a bottom bunk in the corner where he could watch the door. He didn't speak to the other hands, men who were playing cards and swapping lies by the stove. He lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the wooden slats of the bunk above him. He was tired. God, he was so tired. He wanted to sleep for a year, but he knew that when sleep came, the dreams would come with it. Evening settled over Dawn Creek, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. The wind died down, leaving a silence that felt expectant, like a held breath. Eli walked into town. He needed a drink to wash the dust from his throat. He told himself that was the only reason. He pushed through the swinging doors of the Golden Nugget Saloon and stepped into the haze of smoke and noise. The saloon was crowded. Miners, cowboys, and drifters filled the tables. A piano player was hammering out a tune in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the din of voices. Eli moved to the far end of the bar, ordered a whiskey, and turned his back to the room, watching the reflection of the crowd in the mirror behind the bar. That was when he saw her. She was moving through the tables, collecting empty bottles and wiping down spilled beer with a gray rag. She was small, dressed in a plain brown dress that was mended in 3 places. Her hair was pulled back severely, but a few strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale and drawn. It was Nora, Mrs. Larkin had sent her to the saloon to collect the empty bottles the boarding house sold back to the distributor for pennies, and to clean up after the early rush in exchange for a few coins. Eli watched her. She moved with a strange, terrified grace. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the task at hand, her shoulders hunched as if she expected a blow to land at any moment. She was like a deer he had once seen trapped in a box canyon, trembling, silent, waiting for the end. The stillness around her struck him. In a room full of loud, boisterous men, she was a void of silence. It was a silence he recognized. It was the silence of someone who has learned that speaking only brings pain. He took a sip of his whiskey, the burn familiar and grounding. He told himself to look away. She was nothing to him, just another broken thing in a world full of them. But he couldn't stop watching. Nora reached for a bottle on a table occupied by 4 men. They were cowhands from a rival outfit, already drunk and looking for sport. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick beard and eyes that swam with liquor, covered the bottle with his hand just as Nora's fingers brushed it. "Well now," the man slurred. "What do we have here? A little mouse come to steal our whiskey?" Nora froze. The rag in her hand dripped dirty water onto the floor. "I'm just clearing the table." "Sir," she whispered. The man laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "Sir, did you hear that? Boys? She called me sir." He grabbed her wrist, his grip hard and sudden. "You don't have to run off. Mouse, why don't you sit down? You look like you know how to show a man a good time." Nora's chest tightened until she couldn't breathe. The smell of the man, sweat and rye whiskey, flooded her senses, triggering a wave of nausea. It was the same smell, the same grip, the same laughter. The room seemed to tilt. She tried to pull her hand away, but his fingers were like iron. "Please," she gasped, the word barely audible. "Let me go." "Oh, she's shy," the man jeered. "I like them shy. Makes it more fun when they finally scream." He yanked her closer. Nora stumbled, her hip hitting the edge of the table. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. The old fear washed over her, a cold black tide. She couldn't scream. She couldn't fight. She could only endure. From the corner of the bar, Eli set his glass down. He didn't want this. He had promised himself, Ed. No more fights, no more trouble. He was just passing through. But he looked at Nora's face. He saw the terror in her eyes, wide and glassy, and for a split second, the face superimposed over hers was not Nora's, but that of a girl in a village south of the border. A girl he had failed to protect because he had been following orders. The guilt that lived in his gut flared hot and bright. Eli pushed off the bar. He didn't rush. He walked with a steady, measured pace, his boots thudding softly on the floorboards. "Let her go," Eli said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise at the table like a knife. The bearded man looked up, blinking. "Who the hell are you?" the man asked. "I am the man telling you to let go of the lady's arm," Eli said. His tone was conversational, almost bored, but his eyes were flat and cold. The cowboy laughed and stood up, towering over Eli. He didn't let go of Nora. "You looking to die? Stranger, this is none of your business. Go back to your drink before I break your jaw." He shoved Eli with his free hand. It was a mistake. The saloon went quiet as the violence exploded. It happened faster than most of the drunks could follow. Eli didn't stumble back. He stepped into the shove, his left hand coming up to trap the cowboy's wrist. In one fluid motion, he twisted the arm outward, applying pressure against the joint. There was a sickening pop. The cowboy screamed, his grip on Nora springing open instantly. Eli didn't stop. He drove his boot into the back of the man's knee, sending him crashing to the floor. One of the other men at the table, seeing his friend go down, reached for the skinning knife at his belt. Eli saw the movement before the man's hand even touched the handle. He spun, his right leg lashing out in a high arc. His boot connected with the man's wrist, sending the knife clattering across the room. Eli stepped back, his hands raised but open, his posture balanced. He wasn't breathing hard. He looked at the remaining two men at the table. "Anyone else?" he asked softly. The two men looked at their groaning friends, then at the scarred man who stood with such terrifying calm. They shook their heads and slowly raised their hands. The saloon owner, a balding man named Mr. Higgins, came rushing out from behind the bar with a shotgun. "All right, that is enough. Get out, all of you." Eli looked down at Nora. She was standing pressed against the wall, clutching her wrist where the cowboy had grabbed her. Her face was white as a sheet. She looked at Eli with a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked like awe. "You all right?" Eli asked. Nora nodded, unable to find her voice. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "Come on," Eli said. He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back to see if the men were following. He knew they wouldn't. Bullies rarely fought when the odds were evened. Nora followed him. She didn't know what else to do. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. The wind had picked up again, rustling the dry grass at the edge of town. They stood in the shadows of the livery stable, away from the light of the saloon. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She looked at Eli. He was lighting a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the hollows of his cheeks and the scar on his jaw. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was thin, brittle. "You didn't have to do that." Eli shook out the match and tossed it into the dirt. He took a drag of the smoke and exhaled slowly. "I don't like cowards," he said. "A man who puts his hands on a woman isn't a man. He's just a dog that needs kicking." He looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the way she was holding herself together by sheer will. He saw the bruises on her soul that matched the ones on his own. "You should get on home," he said gently. "This town isn't kind to people out after dark." Nora nodded. She wanted to say more. She wanted to ask him who he was, where he came from, why he had eyes that looked 1,000 years old, but the words stuck in her throat. "My name is Nora," she said instead. "Eli Carson," he replied. He tipped his hat, a small, polite gesture that felt strangely intimate in the darkness. Then he turned and walked away toward the bunkhouses at the edge of town. Nora watched him go until he was swallowed by the shadows. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why did he do it? No one had ever stood up for her before, not without wanting payment, not without expecting her to be grateful in ways she couldn't bear. But he had just walked away. She felt exposed, the memory of the cowboy's hand on her wrist still burning. But beneath the fear, there was a tiny, flickering warmth. It was the memory of Eli's voice, calm and steady. "I don't like cowards." She hurried back to the boarding house, the wind pushing at her back. Eli walked alone under the vast canopy of stars. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the sour taste of regret. He flexed his hand. He had promised himself. He was supposed to be invisible. Now, half the town would know his face by morning. The sheriff would be asking questions. He hated the violence. He hated the way it felt so natural, so easy, like slipping on an old glove. He wanted to be a man who built things, not a man who broke them. But he couldn't get the image of Nora out of his head, the way she had looked at him. Not with fear, not really, but with a desperate, silent plea, like she was drowning and he was the only piece of driftwood in the ocean. He reached the bunkhouse and sat on the steps, smoking his cigarette down to the filter. He shouldn't get involved. He should pack his roll and leave in the morning. That was the smart play. But he knew he wouldn't. In her narrow bed at the boarding house, Nora lay awake. The room was cold. The wind scraped against the window pane like a fingernail. She pulled the thin quilt up to her chin. She could still feel the phantom grip on her arm. But then, she closed her eyes and pictured the scarred cowboy. She thought of his hands, rough, deadly, but gentle when they didn't have to be. She lay there in the dark, listening to the creaking of the house, for the first time in years. The silence didn't feel quite so empty. She curled onto her side, hugging the pillow to her chest. She imagined, with a sudden, aching clarity, what it would be like if those steady hands were holding her, not to take, but to give, to shield her from the wind and the world. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping to dampen the pillowcase. She imagined being held without fear, just once before the dawn came to reveal the harsh truth of the world again. The days in Dawn Creek did not pass so much as they ground down, wearing away the edges of the soul like wind against sandstone. For Nora Gallagher. Time was measured in the rhythmic creak of the iron handle at the water pump in the gray light of early morning, and in the number of stitches she set into rough cotton and wool by the fading light of the afternoon. Routine became her armor. She rose before the sun, when the air was still biting cold and the sky was a bruised shade of indigo. She fetched water for Mrs. Larkin's boarding house, her breath puffing out in white clouds, her hands red and stinging as she hauled the heavy buckets. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, the smell of lye soap becoming a permanent scent in her nose, masking the lingering odor of stale tobacco and dust that seemed to permeate every plank of wood in the territory. She walked the streets of the town with her head lowered, carrying baskets of mended clothes or covered plates of food for the ranch hands who paid Mrs. Larkin for a hot meal at midday. Through the veil of her lashes, Nora studied the landscape that was now her prison and her refuge. It was a hard land. The main street was a rutted scar of dirt that turned to sucking mud in the rain and choking powder in the heat. The buildings were weathered gray, beaten by a relentless wind that never seemed to stop howling down from the mountains. But it was the faces of the people that told the truest story of the West. Nora saw women with skin like dried parchment, their eyes narrowed against the glare, looking at her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. She saw men with hands like gnarled roots, their bodies bent from years in the saddle of the mines. They were people hardened by the land, stripped of softness. They looked at Nora, with her pale skin and her quiet ways, and they saw something that did not belong. They saw a weakness that the territory would eventually chew up and spit out. She felt their eyes on her back when she walked to the general store. The silence that fell when she entered was louder than any shout. The whispers followed her like dry leaves skittering on the pavement. "She is the one from back east," a woman would murmur to her neighbor. "Heard she left a man," another would reply. "Or maybe he threw her out," a third would whisper, the words sharp with judgment. Nora swallowed the loneliness. She had learned long ago that defending herself only gave people more words to twist. So she kept her silence, wrapping it around herself like a shawl. Yet, in the midst of this isolation, there was a single thread of connection she could not sever. She saw Eli Carson. It was never a planned meeting. She would be hanging wet sheets on the line behind the boarding house, the wind whipping the white fabric into a frenzy, and she would look up to see him riding past on the ridge, driving a small herd of stragglers toward the McCready grazing lands. Or she would be walking back from the livery stable, the basket empty on her hip, and he would be there, tightening the cinch on his saddle or checking a horseshoe. He looked different from the other men. He sat his horse with a weary, easy grace, as if he and the animal were carved from the same piece of oak. He was always dusted with the gray powder of the trail, his hat pulled low. When their eyes met, time seemed to stutter. It was a brief thing, lasting no longer than a heartbeat. Eli would touch the brim of his hat, a sharp, quick nod. Nora would incline her head slightly, her fingers tightening on her basket. Then he would ride on, and she would walk faster, her heart beating a treacherous rhythm against her ribs. They did not speak. They were two wounded animals circling the same waterhole, wary of the other's pain, wary of the trouble that seemed to trail behind them both like a shadow. In the bunkhouse at the McCready Ranch, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed socks, coal oil, and masculine sweat. The men sat on their bunks or around the pot-bellied stove, whittling wood or mending tack. Eli Carson sat on his bunk in the corner, cleaning his Colt revolver. He did it methodically, stripping the weapon down, wiping the oil, checking the action. It was a ritual that calmed him, even as it reminded him of what he was. "You are a quiet one." "Carson," said a young cowboy named Jeb. He was a freckled kid, barely 20, with a mouth that ran faster than his brain. Eli didn't look up. "I like quiet." Jeb grinned, looking around at the others for an audience. "Heard about what you did at the Golden Nugget. Twisted old Red's arm right out of the socket. They say you moved so fast nobody even saw you draw a breath." "It was just a disagreement," Eli said, sliding the cylinder back into place with a definitive click. "Disagreement?" scoffed an older hand named Silas, no relation to the man back east. But the name still made Eli's gut tighten. "A disagreement is words. What you did was a dismantling. You have done that before. A man does not move like that unless he has practiced." Eli holstered the gun and looked up. His eyes were flat. "I have moved cattle, and I have fixed fences. That is what I am paid for." The older man held his gaze for a moment, then spat into the spittoon. "Maybe, but word is traveling. Sheriff was asking about you, asking if anyone knew the name Carson from down by the border. Said there was a Carson who rode with the Rangers, then rode with some outfits that were not so particular about the law." Eli said nothing. He leaned back against the wall and pulled his hat over his eyes. The rumors were like smoke. You couldn't catch them, and they choked you if you tried to breathe them in. He knew they were talking about him. He knew some of the younger hands looked at him with a dangerous hero worship, hoping to see him draw that gun again. He knew the older men looked at him with distrust, seeing a man who brought trouble. He was walking a razor's edge. He should leave. He should pack his roll and ride west until he hit the ocean. But every time he thought about leaving, he saw a pair of terrified eyes and a pale face. And he found he couldn't tighten the cinch on his horse just yet. The opportunity to speak came 3 days later, born of a torn sleeve and a calculated risk. Eli had snagged his good work shirt on a rusted section of barbed wire while repairing a fence line. He could have mended it himself. He had done so for years on the trail, but he found himself folding the blue flannel carefully and tucking it under his arm as he rode into town that evening. He found Nora sitting on the front porch of Mrs. Larkin's house. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the street. She was sitting in a rocking chair, a basket of mending at her feet, taking advantage of the last lingering light. Eli dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. He walked up the path, his boots crunching on the gravel. Nora looked up, her needle pausing in mid-air. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't retreat. "Evening, Miss Nora," Eli said. "Evening, Mr. Carson," she replied. Her voice was soft, like the rustle of dry grass. He held out the shirt. "Had a run-in with some wire, Mrs. Larkin said you take in mending. I would be happy to pay for the work." Nora looked at the shirt, then at his face. She saw the hesitation there, the awkwardness of a man who was not used to asking for favors. "I can fix it," she said. She took the shirt from him. Her fingers brushed his for a second, and the contact sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with static. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "It will only take a moment. If you would like to wait." Eli sat. He took his hat off and held it in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles. Nora threaded a needle with blue thread. She began to sew, her movements precise and practiced. The silence between them was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the town. It was a tentative thing, fragile but not hostile. "You are good with a needle," Eli said, watching her hands. Nora kept her eyes on the fabric. "I have been sewing since I was a child. It is useful." "Where are you from?" Eli asked. He kept his voice low, gentle. "East," she said. "Pennsylvania, originally. Then other places." She did not elaborate, and he did not push. He knew about other places. He had a map of them scarred into his own memory. "I am from Texas." "Mostly," Eli offered, "though I have not seen it in a few years." "Do you miss it?" Nora asked. She glanced up at him, her gaze resting on the scar that ran down his jaw. "I miss the heat, sometimes," Eli said, "and the bluebonnets in the spring, but the land is just land." "It is the people that make a place, for better or worse." Nora's hand stilled. "Yes," she whispered, "it is the people." She went back to stitching. Eli watched her profile. He noticed the way she held her jaw, tight, as if she were bracing for a blow. He noticed that she never fully relaxed into the chair. She was always poised to run. "You do not have to be afraid here, Nora," Eli said quietly. Nora looked at him. Her eyes were dark pools of old pain. "I'm always afraid. Mr. Carson, it is a habit I cannot seem to break. Call me Eli," he said, "and habits can be broken. It just takes time, and maybe a little help." Nora finished the stitch and bit the thread. She smoothed the fabric and handed the shirt back to him. "Thank you, Eli," she said, testing the name. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 silver coins. He placed them in her hand. Her palm was calloused, but her fingers were delicate. "Thank you, Nora." He stood up, putting his hat back on. He lingered for a moment, wanting to say more, wanting to tell her that he understood the fear, that he lived with it too, but the words were too heavy for the twilight. He walked back to his horse, feeling her eyes on his back, and for the first time in a long time, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. The weather in the territory was a fickle god, giving with one hand and taking with the other. A week after the shirt was mended, the sky turned a strange, sickly shade of copper. The wind, which usually blew in steady gusts, suddenly died. The air grew heavy and still, pressing down on the earth. Nora was out at the edge of town, near the dry creek bed, gathering kindling for Mrs. Larkin's stove. She had walked further than she intended, lost in thought. When she looked up, the mountains had disappeared. A wall of brown was moving across the plain. It was massive, stretching from the ground to the heavens, swallowing the world whole, a dust storm. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Nora's chest. She dropped the kindling and turned to run back toward the town, but the wall moved faster than she expected. It hit her with the force of a physical blow. Instantly, the world vanished. There was no sky, no ground, no town. There was only screaming wind and stinging grit. The sand scoured her face, blinding her, filling her nose and mouth. She coughed, choking on the dry earth. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, but she had lost all sense of direction. Was the town to the left, to the right? The wind howled so loud she couldn't hear her own scream. She tripped over a sagebrush root and fell hard, scraping her palms. She curled into a ball, pulling her skirt over her head, trying to breathe. The fear was total. It was the suffocating darkness of her past come to life, swallowing her whole. She was going to die here, buried under the dirt, and no one would even know. Then, a hand gripped her shoulder. It was a strong, undeniable grip. Nora flinched, screaming into the roar of the wind, but the hand didn't let go. She was hauled upward. Through the swirling brown haze, a figure loomed. A bandana was tied over the lower half of his face, and his hat was pulled down tight, but she knew the eyes. Eli. He didn't try to speak. The wind would have torn the words away. He pulled a second bandana from his pocket and tied it clumsy but tight around Nora's face, covering her nose and mouth. Then he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. He was a solid anchor in the chaos. He turned her, guiding her with the force of his body. He blocked the worst of the wind with his own frame. Nora clung to his duster, burying her face in the leather, trusting him blindly because she had no other choice. They stumbled through the blinding grit for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. Eli moved with purpose, counting steps, feeling the ground. Suddenly, a shape loomed out of the dust. It was the half-built shed behind Mrs. Larkin's boarding house, a structure of raw lumber that was meant to be a new stable. Eli kicked the door open and shoved Nora inside, tumbling in after her. He slammed the door shut against the howling wind and dropped the heavy latch. The noise dropped instantly from a scream to a dull roar. The shed was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The air was thick with dust, but it was breathable. Nora collapsed onto a pile of hay in the corner, tearing the bandana from her face, coughing and gasping. Her lungs burned. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering from the shock. Eli stood by the door for a moment, brushing the worst of the dirt from his coat. Then he came to her. He knelt in the hay, his face close to hers. He pulled his own bandana down. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes intense. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. Nora shook her head, still gasping. I got lost. He came so fast. Breathe," Eli commanded gently. "Just breathe." He reached out and placed a hand on her back, rubbing slow, firm circles. Nora flinched at the touch, her muscles locking up. It was instinct, the expectation of pain. But Eli didn't pull away, and he didn't push harder. He just kept his hand there, a warm, steady weight. Slowly, Nora's breathing evened out. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a keen awareness of their proximity. The shed was small. The storm had narrowed the entire world down to these four walls and the sound of their breathing. She looked at him. He was covered in dust, his eyelashes coated in it. He looked wild, dangerous, and utterly safe. "You found me," she whispered. "I saw you from the ridge." Eli said, "I knew you wouldn't make it back in time." "Why?" Nora asked. "Why come for me? It was dangerous." Eli looked down at his hands. "I told you. I don't like seeing people hurt." He shifted, sitting back against the wall of the shed, pulling his knees up. Nora mimicked him, sitting close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his arm, though they weren't touching. The silence in the shed was different now. It was heavy, charged with something that made the air feel thin. "I am not a good man." "Nora," Eli said suddenly, staring at the opposite wall. "You need to know that. The things people say, some of them are true. I have killed men. I have done things for money that make me sick when I think on them in the dark." Nora watched his profile. "I know," she said. "I can see it in your eyes. Then why aren't you running?" "Because I am not a good woman." "Either," Nora said. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "Back east, the man I ran from, he made me do things. He made me belong to him. He had a paper that said I was his property, and everyone in that town knew it. They looked at me like I was something dirty, and after a while, I started to believe them." She turned her face away. shame burning her cheeks hot. Eli reached out. His fingers, rough and calloused, gently touched her chin, turning her face back toward him. "You are not dirty," he said fiercely. "What happened to you? That is not who you are. That is just what you survived." Nora looked into his eyes and saw her own pain reflected there. He understood. He carried a different kind of shame, a different kind of scar, but the weight was the same. They stared at each other, the distance between them shrinking. The dust swirled in the shafts of light coming through the cracks. The smell of rain hitting the dry earth outside began to seep in, sharp and sweet. Nora felt a pull in her chest, a longing so sharp it frightened her. She wanted to lean forward. She wanted to press her forehead against his, to feel the roughness of his unshaven cheek. She wanted to be held, to be hidden in him. Eli's gaze dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes. His hand was still on her chin, his thumb brushing her skin. He leaned in, just an inch. Nora's breath hitched, but then Eli pulled back. He dropped his hand. He looked away, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He was afraid that his touch would corrupt her, afraid that his violence would bleed onto her. "We should wait out the storm," he said, his voice tight. "Yes," Nora whispered, feeling a mixture of relief and crushing disappointment. "We should wait." They sat in the dim light, side by side, listening to the wind howl, two broken things afraid to see if they fit together. When the wind finally died, they emerged into a ruined world. The yard behind the boarding house was a wreck. Barrels were knocked over, rolling aimlessly in the breeze. A layer of fine brown silt coated everything: the fence, the porch, the laundry line. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun trying to break through the lingering haze. Eli walked Nora to the back door. They were both covered in dust, looking like statues made of clay. Mrs. Larkin was standing on the porch, a broom in her hand. She looked at Eli, then at Nora. Her expression was unreadable, but her lips were pressed into a thin line. "Thank you for bringing her back, Mr. Carson, Mrs." Larkin said stiffly. Eli nodded. "Just happened to be passing." He didn't look at Nora. He touched his hat and walked away, his boots kicking up puffs of dust. Nora watched him go, feeling the cold settle back into her bones. "Mrs." Larkin sighed. "You best get inside and wash up. Nora, people will be talking. They are already talking," Nora said quietly. "Mrs." Larkin softened. "Just a fraction. I know. Child, but in a town like this, talk can be as dangerous as a bullet. You be careful with that one. He has darkness in him." "I know," Nora said, "but he also has light." The gossip started before the dust had even settled. Someone had seen them ride in together. Someone had seen them come out of the shed. By the next morning, the story had twisted and grown. Nora and the gunman. They had been alone in that shed for an hour. Everyone knew what kind of woman Nora was. She had that look, and everyone knew what kind of man Eli was. When Nora walked to the well the next day, the women turned their backs. They gathered in tight circles, their voices dropping to whispers that carried on the wind. Shameless. She heard, "Falling in with a killer. Water seeks its own level." Nora filled her buckets, her hands trembling. She wanted to scream at them. She wanted to tell them that he had saved her life, that he had treated her with more respect in a dusty shed than any of their husbands ever had. But she knew it wouldn't matter. They wanted a villain, and she was the easiest target. She tried to stay away from Eli. She told herself it was for the best. She would only drag him down, and he would only put her in danger. But the heart is a stubborn thing. 2 days later, Nora was walking past the blacksmith's shop. A group of men were loitering there, passing a flask of whiskey. One of them, a man named Cobb who worked at the livery, stepped out to block her path. "Well, look here." Cobb grinned, his teeth yellow. "It is the gunman's whore." Nora flinched as if he had slapped her. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again. "What is the hurry, darling?" Cobb sneered. "If you are giving it away to drifters and sheds, maybe you can spare a little for a local man." The other men laughed. Nora's face burned. Tears of humiliation pricked her eyes. She gripped her basket, her knuckles white. Please let me pass. I will let you pass when I get a kiss, Cobb said, leaning in, his breath sour. Nora recoiled, her back hitting the wall of the shop. That is enough. The voice was not loud, but it stopped the laughter instantly. Eli was standing across the street, leaning against a hitching post. He wasn't wearing his duster today. His hand was resting casually near his hip, near the worn walnut grip of his Colt. Cobb straightened up, his bravado wavering. Stay out of this. Carson, we are just having some fun. You have a strange definition of fun, Eli said. He pushed off the post and walked into the street. He didn't run, he just walked, steady and inevitable. He stopped 5 feet from Cobb. Apologize to the lady, Eli said. Cobb bristled. I ain't apologizing to no. Eli took 1 step forward. The air seemed to drop 10 degrees. His eyes were devoid of anything human. They were the eyes of a wolf looking at a rabbit. Apologize, Eli repeated softly, or I will make you swallow your teeth, and then I will make you apologize. Cobb looked at his friends, but they were all suddenly very interested in their boots. He looked back at Eli, saw the promise of violence in the set of his shoulders, and crumbled. Sorry, Cobb muttered, looking at the ground. Louder, Eli said. I am sorry, ma'am, Cobb said, his face red. Eli stepped back. Get out of here. Cobb and his friends scattered like cockroaches when a lantern is lit. Nora stood against the wall, her chest heaving. She looked at Eli. He looked tired. He looked sad. The townspeople who had watched the exchange were whispering. Some looked at Eli with fear, but others, the washerwoman, the old man who swept the saloon, looked at him with a grudging respect, and they looked at Nora not with judgment, but with curiosity. Eli didn't come closer. He just looked at her, checking to see if she was unharmed. Go home, Nora, he said gently. Then he turned and walked toward the ranch, his head bowed against the wind. Nora watched him go. The fear was still there, the fear of the town, the fear of Silas finding her. But underneath it, there was a fierce, burning gratitude. And something else. She realized, with a terrifying certainty, that she didn't just want him near for safety. She wanted him because he was the only person in the world who saw her. That night, Nora sat on the edge of her bed. The wind was rattling the window pane again. She held the blue flannel shirt in her lap, not the one she had mended for him, but another one she had found in the laundry pile that needed a button. She hadn't told Mrs. Larkin she took it. She traced the stitching on the cuff with her finger. She pressed the fabric to her face. It smelled of sagebrush, tobacco, and him. Her body ached. It was a physical pain, a hollowness in her chest and belly. She longed for his warmth. She longed for the strength of his arms. It was a terrifying feeling. For so long, touch had meant pain. It had meant being used. But now, in the dark, she imagined Eli's touch. She imagined it would be like the fire in the hearth, dangerous if you weren't careful, but the only thing that could keep the cold at bay. She clutched the shirt to her chest and rocked back and forth, listening to the lonely wind, waiting for the dawn, and wondering how long she could keep fighting the tide that was pulling them together. The darkness of the bunkhouse was not empty. It was crowded with ghosts. Eli Carson lay on his back, his body rigid. The thin wool blanket twisted around his legs like a shroud. The air was thick with the scent of sleeping men, sweat, tobacco, and the musty odor of damp wood. But in Eli's mind, the air smelled of sulfur and burning timber. He was asleep, but he was not resting. He was back in a town called Red Rock. 3 years ago. The details were sharp enough to cut. He saw the flash of the muzzle in the twilight. He saw the boy, no older than 18, stumbling back with a look of supreme surprise on his face, a red flower blooming on his white shirt. He saw the barn blazing against the night sky, the sparks spiraling up to join the stars, and he heard the screaming of horses trapped inside. And then, the worst part, the silence that followed, the moment when the gun smoke cleared and he was the only thing left standing, holding a piece of hot iron that had just erased a life. Eli woke with a gasp, his hand flying to the revolver hanging from the bedpost before he even opened his eyes. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sat up, his chest heaving, sweat trickling down his spine despite the chill of the night. The bunkhouse was quiet, save for the snoring of the other hands. Jeb muttered something in his sleep and rolled over. Eli stared into the gloom, his breath trembling. He could not stay here. The walls were too close. The air was too used. He pulled on his boots and grabbed his coat, moving with the silent economy of a man who had spent a lifetime trying not to be heard. He slipped out the door and into the vast, open night. The horses in the corral nickered softly as he approached. He saddled his mare, a sturdy bay with a white blaze, working by touch in the dark. He swung up into the saddle and rode out, leaving the ranch and the sleeping town behind. He rode until he reached a high ridge that overlooked the sprawling plains. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the sea of grass. The wind was constant here, singing a low, lonely song as it moved through the sagebrush. Eli dismounted and let the reins drop. He walked to the edge of the ridge and looked out at the emptiness. It went on forever, a void of shadow and earth. "I do not know how to do this," he said aloud. His voice was swallowed instantly by the wind. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "I do not know how to be a decent man. I have washed my hands, but the stain does not come out." He thought of Nora. He thought of the way she looked at him, with that tentative hope that terrified him more than any gun barrel ever had. She saw something in him that wasn't there. She saw a savior. She didn't know she was looking at a butcher who was just resting between shifts. "I am a fraud," he whispered to the grass. "And when she finds out, she will look at me like the rest of them. And that will kill me faster than a bullet." He stood there for a long time, letting the cold wind numb the heat of his shame, until the eastern horizon began to bleed into a dull gray. The return ride was slow. The dawn was breaking, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and pale orange. When Eli rode into the yard behind the boarding house, the town was still asleep. The silence of the morning was heavy and damp. He stabled the horse and walked toward the back door of the house, intending to grab a cup of water from the pump before heading to the bunkhouse. But as he passed the kitchen window, he saw a light. Nora was inside. She was standing by the stove, her hands wrapped around a mug, staring at nothing. She wore a simple wrapper over her nightdress, her hair loosed down her back in a dark cascade. She looked up as his shadow crossed the window. She didn't jump. She moved to the door and opened it. "You are up early," she said softly. "Couldn't sleep," Eli replied, stopping at the foot of the steps. "Neither could I," she said. "The coffee is hot." Eli hesitated. He was dirty, unshaven, and smelling of horse and night sweat. He felt unworthy of the clean, warm light spilling from the kitchen. But the pull was too strong. He scraped his boots on the scraper and stepped inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of yeast and roasted beans. It was a domestic intimacy that felt alien to him. He sat at the small wooden table while Nora poured a cup of black coffee and set it before him. She sat opposite him, wrapping her hands back around her own mug. They sat in silence for a long time, sipping the hot liquid. The rest of the house creaked overhead as Mrs. Larkin turned in her sleep. But down here, they were in a world of their own. Eli looked at his hands resting on the wood. They were scarred, large, and stained with the dust of the ridge. "I have been thinking," Eli said, his voice gravelly from lack of use. "I should not be here. I should not be sitting at this table with you." Nora looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Why?" "Because you are trying to start over," Eli said. "You are trying to find a clean life. And I am. I am not clean. Nora." He took a breath, forcing himself to look her in the eye. He needed to break this now, before it went any further. He needed to scare her away for her own good. "The stories they tell in town," Eli said, "about me being a gunman. They are true." Nora did not flinch. She set her cup down slowly. "I was hired by the Cattle Association in Wyoming 3 years ago," he continued, the words tumbling out now. "They paid me $100 a month to stop rustlers. But they didn't care about the law. They just wanted the problem gone. I rode with a posse that burned out homesteaders because they were on the wrong land. I shot men who were guilty, and I shot men who were just desperate. I have a name in the territories. Nora. And it is not a good one. It is a name that smells of blood." He waited. He waited for her eyes to widen, for her to push her chair back, for the inevitable revulsion. Nora reached across the table. She did not take his hand, but she laid her fingers on the table near his, close enough that he could feel the warmth. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "God, no," he said violently. "I hated it. I hated every minute of it. But it was the only thing I was good at. It was the only way I knew to survive." Nora looked at his rough, scarred knuckles. Then she looked up at his face, her gaze steady and piercing. "Did you have a choice?" she asked. Eli opened his mouth to say yes, to say that a man always has a choice. But the words died in his throat. He thought of the poverty he came from, the war that had hardened him, the hunger that had driven him to sell his gun. "I don't know," he whispered. Nora nodded slowly. "I understand survival. Eli, I understand doing what you must to keep breathing." She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly on the table. "You think you are the only one with a past?" she said. "You think you are the only one who feels dirty?" Eli frowned. "It is not the same. You are. I was a commodity." Nora cut in, her voice hard. "Silas Hargrove. That is his name. He owned the biggest saloon in the mining district. My father owed him money. When my father died, Silas came with a piece of paper, a contract. He said the debt was mine now. He said I belonged to him until it was paid." She looked down at the coffee, her face pale. "He didn't put me on the street," she said quietly. "He said I was too pretty for that. He made me wear silk dresses that were cut too low. He made me sing on the stage while the miners stared at me. He made me sit at their tables and laugh at their jokes and let them put their hands on my waist. And if I didn't smile, if I didn't act like I was enjoying it, he would add another month to the contract." Eli's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. A cold, murderous rage began to coil in his gut. It was a different kind of anger than he was used to. It wasn't the hot flash of a bar fight. It was the slow, freezing burn of hatred. "He made me feel like a thing," Nora whispered. "Like a chair or a glass, something to be used and put away. I sang for 2 years. Eli, I smiled until my face hurt. And inside, I went numb. I stopped being Nora. I just became the girl in the blue dress." She looked up, tears standing in her eyes but not falling. "I ran because I heard him selling me." She said he was talking to a friend of his from San Francisco. He was negotiating a price, like I was a horse. That was when I realized the debt would never be paid. The contract was a lie. He was never going to let me go. Eli reached out then. He covered her hand with his own. His grip was gentle, careful, as if she were made of spun glass. "He will never touch you again," Eli said. His voice was low, vibrating with a terrifying promise. "I swear to you, Nora, as long as I am breathing, he will never touch you again." Nora turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. Her grip was desperate, strong. "I don't care about your past, Eli," she said. "I don't care what you did to survive. I only care about the man who is sitting here now, the man who saved me in the storm, the man who defended me in the street. That is the man I see." They sat there as the sun fully rose, flooding the kitchen with golden light. They were two ruins, battered and scarred, but in the wreckage of their confessions, they had built a foundation. They felt naked, stripped of their secrets, but the weight that had been crushing them both was suddenly shared. The days that followed had a new quality to them. The tension of the unknown was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering awareness. The town of Dawn Creek was still dusty and harsh. The wind still blew, but for Nora and Eli, the world had softened at the edges. They found excuses to be near each other. It was in the small things, the moments that no one else noticed. One morning, Nora was collecting eggs from the coop behind the boarding house. A speckled hen, known for its bad temper and wandering spirit, made a break for the open gate. Nora lunged for it, her basket swinging, her hair coming loose from its pins. "Come back here, you wretch!" she cried, diving for the bird. Eli, who had been repairing a section of the fence nearby, watched her. He saw her slip in the dust, right herself, and finally corner the hen against the water trough. She scooped it up, clutching the squawking bird to her chest, breathless and triumphant. She looked up and saw him watching. She flushed, expecting mockery. Instead, she started to laugh. It was a rusty sound at first. Then it bloomed into something genuine and bright. "Did you see that?" she called out. "Hoisting the chicken. I think I am getting faster." Eli chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "I think the chicken just gave up out of pity," he teased. It was a small moment, meaningless to history. But to Eli, it was a revelation. He had made her laugh. After all the darkness she had spilled in the kitchen, she could still laugh. It made his chest ache with a sudden, fierce affection. Later that week, as Eli was hammering a loose board on the porch, Nora brought him a ladle of water from the bucket. She held it out, and as he took it, his fingers brushed against her wrist. The contact was electric. Eli paused, the ladle halfway to his mouth. He looked at her. Nora was looking at his throat, at the sweat tracing a line down his neck. The air between them grew thick and hot, charged with a desire that was terrified to name itself. Nora watched the way his shirt, damp with exertion, clung to his shoulders. She saw the muscles shift as he moved. She realized, with a start, that she was not just looking at a protector. She was looking at a man, and for the first time in her life, the thought of a man's hands did not make her recoil. It made her blood hum. Eli drank the water in one long swallow and handed the ladle back. His eyes lingered on her mouth. He wanted to kiss her. The urge was so strong it nearly knocked him over. He wanted to pull her close and bury his face in her hair. But he stepped back. He remembered the men in the saloons, the men who took what they wanted because they were stronger. He remembered Silas Hargrove. I have to get back to work," Eli stammered, turning away abruptly. Nora watched him attack the wood with his hammer, striking it harder than necessary. She felt the rejection sting, but then she saw the set of his jaw, the tension in his back. He wasn't rejecting her. He was fighting himself. One evening, after the work was done and the town was settling into the blue hour of twilight, they went for a walk. It had become a tacit ritual. They walked along the edge of the town, where the buildings gave way to the open sagebrush. The sky was a masterpiece of the west, deep purples bleeding into fiery reds. The clouds streaked with gold. The air was cooling rapidly, carrying the sharp, clean scent of sage and cooling earth. They walked close enough that their arms brushed occasionally. "It is beautiful," Nora said, looking at the horizon. "It is so big. Sometimes it scares me, but tonight it just looks peaceful." Eli looked at her. The dying light caught the curve of her cheek, the softness of her mouth. She looked younger. The lines of strain around her eyes smoothed away. "It is better with company," Eli said softly. Nora looked down at her hands. "Eli, yes, do you think people can really start over? Or are we just fooling ourselves?" Eli stopped walking. He turned to face her. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "I don't know if we can scrub the past clean. Nora, I think the stains stay, but I think maybe we can build something new on top of it, something strong enough to cover the cracks." Nora looked up at him. Her eyes were swimming with unshed tears. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were trembling. "I want to believe that," she whispered. Eli squeezed her hand. His thumb rubbed over her knuckles, rough skin against soft. "We will make it true," he said. "We will make it true." They stood there, holding hands in the twilight, poised on the edge of something fragile and beautiful. It was a moment of perfect, suspended hope. And then, the sound of hoofbeats shattered it. They turned to look down the main road leading into town. A group of riders was approaching. There were 5 of them. They did not ride like cowboys coming in off the range, slumped and weary. They rode with backs straight, their horses high-stepping. As they drew closer, the details became clear. The men were wearing dusters, but underneath, their clothes were too fine for Dawn Creek. They wore clean hats and polished boots, They carried rifles in scabbards that looked well-oiled. In the lead was a man on a large black stallion. He wore a gray suit and a silk vest. His face was smooth, handsome in a predatory way, with a mustache waxed to sharp points. Nora gasped. The sound was like a physical blow. She went rigid, her hand turning to ice in Eli's grip. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." Eli looked at her. Her face had drained of all color. She looked like a ghost. "Silas," she whispered. Eli turned his gaze back to the riders. His eyes narrowed. The peace of the evening evaporated, replaced instantly by the cold, familiar clarity of violence. Silas Hargrove and his men rode past them without noticing the couple standing in the shadows of the sagebrush. They rode straight for the Golden Nugget Saloon, dismounting with the arrogance of men who owned the ground they walked on. Silas threw his reins to a boy on the boardwalk and strode through the swinging doors, his men fanning out behind him. Eli felt Nora shaking. Her whole body was vibrating. "He found me," she whimpered. "He actually came." Eli gripped her shoulders, turning her to face him. "Listen to me. Go to the boarding house. Go to your room and lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Mrs. Larkin." "But he has men," Nora said, her voice rising in panic. "He has guns." "So do I," Eli said, calm and cold. "Go, now." Nora hesitated for a second, then turned and ran. She ran like a hunted thing, disappearing into the shadows of the back streets. Eli stood alone for a moment. He checked the load in his Colt. Then he walked toward the saloon. He didn't go in. He stood by the window, peering over the painted glass. Silas was standing at the bar. He had ordered a bottle of the best whiskey. He was talking loudly, his voice booming through the room. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. He waved it in the air. "I am looking for a girl," Silas announced. "A thief and a liar. Name of Nora Gallagher." The room went quiet. Heads turned. "She ran off with my money." Silas lied, his voice smooth and convincing. "Stole from my safe after I took her in off the streets. Gave her a home, gave her work. And this is how she repays me." He unfolded the paper. "I have a contract here, legal and binding. She belongs to my establishment. I am here to collect my property and see justice done," the men in the saloon murmured. Silas was a convincing actor. He played the part of the wronged benefactor perfectly. "She is a clever one," Silas continued. "Pouring a drink, probably spun you some sob story. Cried some crocodile tears. But do not be fooled. Gentlemen, she is a fallen woman, a whore who robbed the man who tried to save her." Eli watched the faces of the townspeople. He saw the doubt creeping in. He saw the way they nodded. It was easier to believe that the stranger was a whore and a thief than to believe she was a victim. It was a juicier story. Word began to spread before Silas even finished his drink. Men slipped out the back door to tell their wives. The gossip moved like a contagion through Dawn Creek. "Did you hear? That Nora girl. She is a thief. She is wanted." Eli turned away from the window. His stomach churned with disgust. He walked quickly to the boarding house. He found Nora in the kitchen again. But the warmth was gone. The fire in the stove had died down. She was sitting in the dark, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth. He told them. She said dull and flat. "I can hear them outside. I can hear them whispering." Eli knelt beside her. He took her hands. They were cold as death. "He is lying," Eli said. "It doesn't matter," Nora said, looking at him with dead eyes. "He has the paper. He has the money. In this world, that is all that matters. He will take me back, Eli, and this time, he will make sure I never run again." She looked at the knife on the table. A dull paring knife. Her eyes lingered on it. "I won't go back," she whispered. "I will not let him touch me again." Eli grabbed her face, forcing her to look at him. "You are not going back," he said, "and you are not giving up. Do you hear me? He has 5 men. Eli, you are 1 man. I am enough," Eli said. "I promised you, Nora, as long as I am breathing." He stood up. He paced the small room, his mind racing. He knew how this worked. Silas would wait until morning. He would let the fear soak in. He would let the town turn against her so that when he dragged her out, no one would lift a finger to stop him. "We wait until dawn," Eli said. "We stay here. If he comes to this door tonight, he dies." They waited. The night stretched out, an eternity of silence and fear. Nora sat in the chair. Eli sat by the door, his gun in his lap. When the sun finally rose, it brought no relief. It brought the sound of boots on the hard-packed dirt of the main street. Eli stood up and moved to the window. He looked out. Silas Hargrove was standing in the middle of the street, flanked by his hired guns. He looked fresh, rested, and supremely confident. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered on the boardwalks, watching with morbid curiosity. Silas took a step forward. He looked straight at the boarding house. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Nora Gallagher!" he shouted. The name echoed off the wooden buildings. "I know you are in there. Nora! Come on out, girl. I have come to claim what is mine." Nora stood up in the kitchen. She was trembling so hard she could barely stand. She looked at Eli. Eli looked back at her. His face was set in stone. He holstered his gun. "Stay behind me," he said. He opened the door, and they stepped out onto the porch to face the morning and the man who wanted to own her soul. The sun hung high and white over Dawn Creek, bleaching the color from the wooden facades of the buildings and turning the dust of the main street into a blinding glare. It was a harsh light, the kind that left no shadows for secrets to hide in. Nora Gallagher stood on the steps of the boarding house, her hand gripping the railing, feeling exposed as if the very air were stripping her bare. Silas Hargrove stood in the center of the street. He did not look like a man who had ridden hard across the territory. He had brushed the dust from his fine gray suit, and his boots shone with a fresh polish. He held his hat in one hand and a folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper in the other. He looked every inch the respectable businessman, the aggrieved party seeking justice. Behind him, his hired men stood near their horses, hands resting casually near their holsters, their eyes scanning the gathering crowd with bored menace. "Citizens of Dawn Creek," Silas began, his voice booming with a practiced theatricality that reached every corner of the street. "I ask for your pardon for this disturbance. I am a man of peace, a man of commerce. I did not come here to cause trouble in your fine town." He turned slowly, making eye contact with the shopkeepers and wives who had stepped out onto the boardwalks. "I came only to retrieve what was stolen from me," Silas said, his voice dropping to a tone of sorrowful regret. "I came for a girl who I took in when she had nothing. A girl I treated like a daughter." He pointed a manicured finger at Nora. Nora felt the collective gaze of the town shift toward her. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. "Come down here." "Nora," Silas called out, his voice dripping with a mock kindness that made her skin crawl. "Come down. My girl, there is no need for this charade to continue. You have had your little adventure. You have spent the money you took from my safe. I am willing to forgive that. I just want you to come home and honor your word." Nora's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lie was so bold, so complete, that it stole the breath from her lungs. She had never touched his safe. She had left with nothing but the clothes on her back. Sheriff Miller stepped out of his office, adjusting his belt. He was a thick-set man with a face that had gone soft from too much beer and too many easy bribes. He looked at Silas, then at the paper in his hand, and nodded deferentially. "What is the trouble here, mister?" "Hargrove?" the sheriff asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the script. "This young woman," Silas said, waving the paper, "signed a contract of employment with me 2 years ago. It binds her to my service for a period of 5 years, in exchange for the settlement of her late father's substantial debts. A generous arrangement. I thought, but 3 weeks ago, she fled in the night, taking a considerable sum of cash and leaving her obligations unfulfilled." He unfolded the paper. It was covered in dense, spidery handwriting and stamped with an official-looking seal. "It is all here. "Sheriff," Silas said, "legal and binding. She belongs to my establishment until the debt is paid, and by my calculations, with interest and the cost of her retrieval, she has a great deal of work left to do." The townspeople murmured. They were simple people, hard-working and law-abiding. They respected paper. A contract was a sacred thing in a land where a man's word was his bond. If she had signed it, if she had taken his money, then she was in the wrong. "That is a lie," Nora finally managed to shout. The words tore from her throat, ragged and desperate. "I never took your money. And that contract, you told me it was for 6 months. You tricked me." Silas smiled, a sad, indulgent smile. "Oh, Nora, still telling stories. You always did have a vivid imagination. Is that not right?" He looked at the crowd. "She is a spirited thing. That is why she was so popular with the gentlemen at my club." The implication hung in the hot air like a foul smell. He did not say the word, but everyone heard it. Popular, club. The women on the boardwalk stiffened, pulling their shawls tighter. The men looked at Nora with a new, dark appraisal. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "I scrubbed floors," she stammered, her voice shaking so hard it was barely audible. "I sang songs. That is all I did. I never—" But the words tangled in her throat. The old silence, the one she had lived with for years, rose up to choke her. She looked at the faces of the people she had sewn for, the people she had served food to. They were closing off. They were judging her. To them, she was just a soiled dove from the city who had tried to play them for fools. Silas saw her falter. He pressed his advantage. "You know what you are." "Nora," he said softly, but his voice carried, "And you know what you owe me, for the protection I gave you, for the favors you did to keep a roof over your head." Nora felt dirty. She felt as if he had stripped her naked in the middle of the street and smeared her with mud. She wanted to curl up and die. She wanted the earth to open and swallow her whole. That is enough. Eli Carson stepped down from the porch of the boarding house. He moved between Nora and Silas, his body forming a barrier. He stood with his feet apart, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his duster sweeping back to reveal the worn handle of his revolver. "She is not going anywhere with you, Hargrove," Eli said. His voice was low, flat, and hard as granite. "And that paper is not worth the ink used to sign it." Silas looked at Eli. His smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of recognition. "Ah," Silas said, "and here's the hero. I wondered when you would step in." He turned back to the sheriff. "Sheriff, do you know who this man is? This is Eli Carson. They call him the Butcher of Red Rock." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The name was known. It was a name whispered in campfires, a name attached to stories of range wars and burning barns. "He is a hired killer," Silas continued, his voice rising in righteous indignation. "A man who shoots first and doesn't ask questions at all. He has killed more men than the fever, and now he is threatening a lawful businessman trying to recover his property." The sheriff's hand drifted to his own gun. "Is this true, son?" the sheriff asked Eli. "Are you the Carson who rode with the Cattle Association?" Eli didn't look at the sheriff. He kept his eyes locked on Silas. "I am not that man anymore, and this woman is not property. She is a human being." Silas laughed. "A killer preaching morality. Now I have seen everything. Tell me, Carson, how much is she paying you, or is she paying you in trade?" Eli's hand twitched. The rage flared white-hot in his vision. He wanted to draw. He wanted to put a bullet right between Silas's eyes and end this. But he saw the sheriff's hand on his gun. He saw the hired men tense. And he saw the townspeople, the blacksmith, the storekeep, the women backing away, looking at him with fear and revulsion. They didn't see a defender. They saw a killer protecting a whore. Silas had won, not with bullets, but with words. He had turned the town into his weapon. The sheriff stepped forward. "Now, look here, Carson. We don't want any trouble. Mr. Hargrove has the law on his side. If the girl signed the paper, she has to go. You step aside, or I will have to arrest you for obstructing justice." Eli looked around. He saw the trap closing. If he drew his gun, he would have to kill the sheriff, and then he would be exactly what they said he was, and Nora would be left alone in the bloodbath. He looked at Nora. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. She looked at him as if he were the last solid thing in a dissolving world. Eli made a choice. He relaxed his stance. He took a step back, moving closer to Nora. "This isn't over," Eli said to Silas. Silas smirked. "It looks over to me. I'll give her an hour to pack her things. I want her ready to ride at noon." Eli turned to Nora. He gripped her elbow. Hard. Inside. He whispered, "Now." They retreated into the boarding house. The heavy oak door shut out the glare of the sun, but it couldn't shut out the shame. "Mrs. Larkin was standing in the hallway." She looked at Nora, then at Eli. Her face was hard, but her eyes were sad. "I can't have gunplay in my house." "Eli," she said, "I run a respectable establishment." Eli nodded. "We're leaving." He turned to Nora. "Listen to me. Pack a bag. Small. Only what you need to survive. Food, a blanket, a coat." Nora wiped her eyes. "Leaving? But where?" "Anywhere but here," Eli said. "We can't fight them here. Nora, the town is against us. The law is against us. If we stay, he takes you. He takes me," Nora repeated, the words sounding foreign and thick. "Pack," Eli commanded. "Meet me behind the shed as soon as it is fully dark. Do not let anyone see you leave." He turned and went out the back door, heading for the livery stable to prepare the horses. Nora went to her room. She moved like a sleepwalker. She opened her small carpet bag. She put in a loaf of bread she had saved, a piece of dried cheese, her heavy woolen shawl. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the shawl twice. She looked around the small, stark room that had been her sanctuary. She saw the mending on the chair. She saw the pitcher of water. It wasn't much, but it had been hers. She went to the small drawer in the washstand and pulled out a tiny object wrapped in a scrap of velvet. She unwrapped it. It was a small wooden bird, whittled from cedar, clumsy and rough. Her father had made it for her when she was 5, before the debts, before the drinking, before he died and left her to Silas. She gripped the bird in her fist. It was the only proof she had that she had once belonged to a family, that she had once been a child and not a contract. She tucked it into the pocket of her dress. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the light to die. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of black velvet thrown over the world. The wind had picked up, biting and cold, carrying the scent of coming rain. Nora slipped out the back window, lowering herself silently into the alley. She crept toward the shed, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the whole town could hear it. Eli was waiting. He had 2 horses saddled, his bay and a roan mare he had bought from the stablemaster with his last month's wages. He handed Nora the reins. "Quiet," he whispered. They mounted in silence. Eli led the way, keeping to the soft dirt behind the buildings to muffle the sound of the hooves. They skirted the edge of town, moving like ghosts through the sagebrush. As they passed the last house, Nora looked back. The lights of the Golden Nugget were blazing. She could hear the faint sound of a piano and laughter. Silas was celebrating. He thought he had won. She turned her back on Dawn Creek and followed Eli into the darkness. The open land at night was a terrifying void. There was no horizon, only an endless stretch of black where the earth met the sky. Nora felt small, untethered. But ahead of her, the dark shape of Eli's back was a constant point of reference. She fixed her eyes on him and rode. They rode for hours. They rode until their legs went numb and their hands cramped on the reins. They rode until the stars began to fade and the eastern sky turned the color of bruised iron. The dawn brought no warmth. It brought a gray, sullen light and a view of the harsh, unforgiving country they had entered. They were in the foothills now, a land of jagged rocks, scrub oak, and deep, twisting draws. Eli pulled his horse up on a rise and looked back. He took a spyglass from his saddlebag and scanned the horizon. "Damn," he muttered. "What is it?" Nora asked, her voice raspy. "Dust," Eli said, "about 5 miles back. They are coming." Silas had not waited for noon. He had discovered her gone and sent his men after them at first light. "We have to push," Eli said. "We have to get into the high country. The rocks will hide our tracks." The chase that followed was a blur of misery. They rode hard, scrambling up steep shale slopes where the horses slipped and scrambled. They crossed creeks that were swollen with snowmelt, the water reaching the horses' bellies and soaking their boots with freezing liquid. The weather turned against them. By midday, the gray sky opened up. It didn't rain. It sleeted. Tiny pellets of ice drove sideways on the wind, stinging their faces like needles. The temperature plummeted. Nora was freezing. Her coat was soaked through. Her teeth chattered so violently, her jaw ached. She couldn't feel her feet in the stirrups. She clung to the saddle horn, her head bowed against the gale, focusing only on the rhythm of the horse's breathing. Eli dropped back to ride beside her. He saw her blue lips, the way she was swaying in the saddle. She couldn't take much more of this. The cold would kill her before Silas's men ever did. He looked around desperately. They were in a narrow canyon, the walls of rock rising steep on either side. "There!" he shouted over the wind. He pointed to a dark shape nestled in a cluster of stunted pines against the canyon wall. It was a line cabin, a rough shelter built by cattlemen for winter range checks, likely abandoned for years. It was barely a shack, its roof sagging and its logs weathered gray. But it had 4 walls. They rode up to it. Eli dismounted and nearly fell. His legs stiff with cold, he grabbed Nora's bridle and helped her down. She stumbled, her knees buckling. He caught her, holding her upright. She felt like a block of ice. "Get inside," he yelled. He quickly led the horses into the lee of the cabin, tying them to a sturdy branch where they would have some protection from the wind. He grabbed his saddlebags and Nora's carpet bag and shoved the cabin door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, it was dark and smelled of rat droppings, old pine, and dust. But it was dry. Eli kicked the door shut and bolted it. The silence inside was sudden and profound. Though the wind still shrieked against the logs outside, he moved quickly to the small stone hearth in the corner. There was a stack of old wood, dry as bone, piled next to it. Thank God for careful cowboys. He struck a match, his fingers clumsy with cold. The flame flared, catching the dry moss and kindling. In minutes, a fire was crackling, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Eli turned to Nora. She was standing in the middle of the room, dripping water onto the dirt floor. She was shivering so hard her whole body convulsed with it. "You have to get those wet clothes off," Eli said. "You will catch your death." He turned his back to her, giving her privacy. He stripped off his own duster and heavy shirt, laying them near the fire to dry. He was left in his undershirt and trousers. He rubbed his arms briskly, trying to get the blood flowing. He heard the rustle of wet fabric behind him. I can't," Nora stammered. Her fingers were too numb to work the buttons of her dress. Eli turned around. Nora was fumbling uselessly with her bodice, tears of frustration leaking from her eyes. She looked small and broken. "Let me," Eli said gently. He stepped close. His large hands brushed hers aside. He worked the buttons with surprising dexterity. He peeled the sodden wool dress from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. She was left in her chemise and petticoats, which were damp but not soaked. He grabbed the dry blanket from his saddle roll and wrapped it around her shoulders. He guided her to the hearth, sitting her down on the dirt floor close to the flames. "Sit," he said. "Get warm." He sat down next to her, close enough to share the heat but not touching. They stared into the fire, the orange light playing over their faces. Outside, the storm raged. The wind hammered the roof, looking for a way in. But for now, they were safe. Nora stopped shivering slowly. The warmth of the fire began to penetrate her bones. She pulled the blanket tighter. "I thought I was going to die out there," she whispered. "I wouldn't let that happen," Eli said. Nora looked at the fire. The silence in the cabin was different than the silence of the plains. It was intimate. "I have always hated the silence," she said suddenly. Her voice was low, almost talking to herself. Eli looked at her. "Why?" "Because that is when I disappear," she said. "When I was with Silas, in the mornings, before the saloon opened, it was so quiet, and I would sit there and feel like I was fading away, like if no one spoke to me, if no one touched me, I would just turn into dust and blow away." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dark and bottomless. "That is why I let him. Let him own me for so long, because even his cruelty was better than being nothing, at least when he was yelling. I knew I existed." Eli felt a crack in his chest. He understood that terror. He knew the feeling of needing pain just to feel alive. "You aren't nothing." "Nora," he said, "you are the strongest woman I have ever known." Nora shook her head. "I am not strong. I am terrified. I am terrified right now." She shifted, the blanket slipping slightly. She moved closer to him. "But when I am with you, I don't feel like I'm disappearing," she said. "When you look at me, I feel real. When you touch me, I feel like I have weight." Eli's breath hitched. He could smell the scent of rain in her skin, clean and sweet. He could feel the heat of her body radiating toward him. He clenched his hands into fists. He wanted her. God, he wanted her. But he was afraid. He was afraid that he was just another man taking advantage of her fear. He was afraid that his hands, stained with so much blood, would ruin her. "I can't, Nora," he rasped. I am not the man you think I am. I am broken. I will only hurt you." He tried to pull away, to put distance between them. But Nora wouldn't let him. She reached out, her hand catching his arm. Her fingers traced the white line of a scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "We are both broken." "Eli," she whispered, "that is why we fit." She moved closer, until her knees were touching his. She let the blanket fall open. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't make me be alone in the dark tonight. I don't want to be silent anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, her soul bare. "Hold me, Eli. Hold me tight before dawn. Please, don't let go." The dam inside Eli broke. The restraint, the guilt, the fear. It all washed away under the force of her need and his own desperate hunger. He groaned, a sound torn from his chest, and reached for her. He didn't grab her. He gathered her. His arms went around her, pulling her into him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in. Nora let out a sob of relief and wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. They fell back onto the saddle blankets spread on the floor. The firelight danced on the walls, casting long shadows that flickered and swayed. It was not a taking. It was a giving. Eli touched her with a reverence that made Nora weep. He traced the line of her jaw, her throat, her collarbone, as if he were memorizing her. He kissed her, softly at first, then with a fierce, starving intensity. Nora met him. She arched into his touch, shedding the shame that Silas had layered on her skin. With every kiss, with every touch, she reclaimed herself. She wasn't property. She wasn't a contract. She was flesh and blood and desire. In the small, storm-battered cabin, surrounded by the dark and the cold, they found a sanctuary in each other. They made love with a slow, desperate urgency, trying to say with their bodies what they didn't have the words for. They were two lonely souls colliding, fusing together to keep the emptiness at bay. Later, much later, the fire burned low, turning to glowing embers. The storm outside began to ease, the wind dropping to a low moan. They lay tangled together under the wool blanket. Nora's head rested on Eli's chest. She could hear the steady thrum of his heart. She felt safe. For the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly safe. Eli stroked her hair, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams. He held her tight, just as she had asked. He knew that outside this cabin, the world was still hunting them. He knew that when the sun rose, Silas's men would be closing in. He knew that the running had to end. He tightened his arm around her. He would not let her go. He would not let anyone take this feeling away from him. Nora shifted in her sleep, murmuring his name. Eli kissed the top of her head. "Sleep," He whispered into the darkness. Sleep now, the dawn was coming. And with it, the hardest choice of all. But for now, in the quiet dark, they had this, and it was enough. The light that entered the cabin did not come all at once. It seeped through the chinking in the log walls, a pale, milky gray that carried the chill of the high country. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the rough timber roof. Eli Carson woke first. He did not move. He lay on the hard earth floor, the wool blanket pulled up to his chin, with the weight of Nora Gallagher resting against his chest. Her breathing was slow and even, a soft rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. He stared up at the wooden beams, tracing the grain with his eyes. A strange sensation washed over him, a mixture of peace and terror so potent it made his throat tight. He had woken up in strange places before, in ditches, in fine hotels, in the mud of a battlefield. But he had never woken up feeling like this. He felt anchored. He looked down at Nora. In the gray light, her face was relaxed, the lines of fear that usually bracketed her mouth smoothed away by sleep. Her dark hair was spread across his shoulder like spilled ink. He felt a fierce, protective surge in his blood, followed instantly by the cold dread of reality. The world outside this cabin had not changed. Silas Hargrove was still hunting them. The law was still bought and paid for. They were still two fugitives with nothing but a tired horse and a few rounds of ammunition between them and a rope. Nora stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered, and she took a deep breath, shifting slightly. She opened her eyes, disoriented for a moment, before her gaze found his face. The memory of the night before rushed back to fill the space between them. A sudden, shy awkwardness settled in the air. Nora pulled the blanket higher, her cheeks flushing a faint pink. She looked at Eli, then looked away, then looked back, her eyes searching his for regret. "Good morning," Eli whispered. His voice was rough with sleep. "Good morning," Nora replied softly. She did not pull away. Instead, she rested her hand on his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his undershirt. "Is the storm gone?" she asked. Eli listened to the silence. "Yes, it has passed." They lay there for a few minutes longer, delaying the inevitable. Eli leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. It was a chaste, gentle thing, but it carried the weight of a promise. Nora closed her eyes and leaned into it, savoring the warmth. It felt fragile. This peace, it felt like holding a soap bubble in the wind. Eventually, the cold forced them to move. Eli rose first, stoking the dying embers of the fire until they flared back into life. He added the last of the dry wood. Nora dressed near the warmth, her movements modest, turning her back as she fastened her bodice. They ate a breakfast that was more duty than pleasure, strips of dried beef that tasted like leather and the last of the stale bread Nora had packed. They sat cross-legged on the floor, chewing slowly, the silence stretching out again. "We have to decide," Eli said, breaking the quiet. Nora stopped chewing. She looked at the fire. "I know, we can keep riding west," Eli said. "We can try to make it over the pass. It will be hard riding, and the snow will be deep up high. But if we make it to the other side, we might lose them. We could go to California." Nora looked at him. "Is that what you want? To run?" Eli sighed, running a hand over his face. "I have been running for a long time. Nora, I am good at it. It keeps you alive. But it does not make you free." Nora said. "No," Eli admitted. "It does not." Nora set her bread down. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "If we run, Silas will never stop. He is a man who collects things. He hates to lose something he thinks he owns. He will send men, he will send telegrams. Every time we ride into a new town, I will be looking over my shoulder. Every time a stranger looks at me, I will think it is him." She looked at Eli, her eyes clear and steady. "I do not want to live like that." She said, "I lived in fear for 2 years. I swallowed my voice until I almost forgot how to speak. Last night, for the first time, I felt like I was a whole person. If we run, I think I will lose that." Eli looked at her. He saw the steel beneath the softness. He saw the woman who had survived humiliation and abuse and was still standing. "So we go back," Eli said. It was not a question. "We go back," Nora said. "We go back and we tell the truth. Not in a dark room, but in the light. I want to look him in the eye and tell him that I am not his, even if my voice shakes. Even if no one believes me, I have to say it." Eli nodded slowly. He reached out and took her hand. "If we go back, it will be dangerous," he said. "Silas has the sheriff. He has the town's ear. Then we make them listen." Nora said. Eli squeezed her hand. "All right, we go back, but not as fugitives. We go back to fight. I will stand with you." "Nora," Eli said, his voice low and fierce. "Not just to save you, but because I am tired of hiding. Too, I am tired of letting men like Silas and the sheriff decide what is right." They finished their meal with a new sense of purpose. They packed their meager belongings, kicked dirt over the fire, and stepped out into the morning. The air was crisp and cold, biting at their lungs. The sun was struggling to crest the canyon walls. They saddled the horses, Eli checking the cinches with extra care. He helped Nora mount, his hands lingering on her waist for a second longer than necessary. They rode out of the draw, turning their backs on the safety of the wilderness and pointing their horses toward Dawn Creek. "We need more than words," Eli said as they navigated the rocky trail back down toward the foothills. "Silas has a contract. He has the law on his side. We need proof that he is a liar." Nora looked at him. "What kind of proof?" "There is a settlement about 10 miles south of here," Eli said. "An old couple named Thompson lives there. I worked with Isaac Thompson a few years back, driving cattle. He is a hard man, but honest. And he used to do business with Silas before things went sour. You think he knows something?" "I know he does," Eli said. "He told me once, when he was deep in a bottle of whiskey, that he kept records. He said Silas cheated him out of a land claim and bribed the land office to look the other way. If Isaac still has those papers, it might be enough to show the town who Silas really is." They rode hard, pushing the horses as much as they dared on the slick ground. The landscape was harsh and indifferent to their struggle. Hawks circled high above in the pale blue sky, screaming their hunting cries. The sun glared off the dry rocks, dazzling their eyes. By early afternoon, they reached the settlement. It was little more than a sod house and a sturdy barn tucked into a fold of the land near a trickle of water. Isaac Thompson was chopping wood by the porch. He was a bear of a man, gray-bearded and stooped with age, but he still swung the axe with power. He stopped as they rode up, his hand going to the rifle leaning against the wood pile. "State your business." Thompson growled. "It is Eli Carson." "Isaac," Eli called out, keeping his hands visible. Thompson squinted, shading his eyes. "Carson? I heard you were dead." "Or in jail." "Not yet," Eli said. He dismounted and helped Nora down. Thompson lowered the rifle but didn't smile. A woman appeared in the doorway of the sod house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was small and bird-like, with sharp eyes. "Who is it? Isaac?" she called. "Just a stray dog I used to know," Thompson said, though there was no real malice in it. "And he brought a lady. They were invited inside. The house was warm and smelled of baking bread. They sat at a rough-hewn table while Mrs. Thompson poured chicory coffee. Eli didn't waste time. He told them everything. He told them about Silas, the contract, the confrontation in the street, and the flight to the cabin. He spoke plainly, without embellishment. When he finished, Isaac Thompson sat back in his chair, stroking his beard. He looked at Nora. "Is it true?" "Girl?" Thompson asked. "Did he force that paper on you?" "Yes, sir," Nora said. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. "He used my father's debts. He said I had no choice." Thompson grunted. "Sounds like him. Silas Hargrove is a snake in a suit. He tried the same on me 5 years ago. Tried to tell me my deed was no good, that I owed back taxes I had already paid. He had the tax collector in his pocket." "Do you have proof?" Eli asked. "You told me once you kept a ledger." Thompson looked at his wife. She nodded slightly. "I kept it," Thompson said. "I kept it because I thought one day I might need it to keep him off my land. I never showed it to the law because the law in these parts is usually bought by men like Silas. I didn't want my barn burned down. We are going back to face him, Eli said. If we had that ledger, and maybe a letter from you stating what he did, it could turn the town. Thompson hesitated. He looked at his hands. It is a big risk, son. It is the right thing to do. Isaac, Mrs., Thompson said sharply. She stood up and walked to a heavy oak chest in the corner. She dug through the linens and pulled out a leather-bound book and a bundle of papers. She slammed them on the table in front of her husband. You have been complaining about that man for years. Now is the time to do something about it. Thompson sighed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. She is the boss. Carson, you should know that. He opened the ledger. Here, look at these dates. Payments to the sheriff. Payments to the land office. And here, see this? This is a copy of the contract he tried to push on me. It has the same clauses he used on the girl. It proves a pattern of fraud. I will write a letter, Thompson said, reaching for a bottle of ink and a pen. I will swear to it. While the men worked, Mrs. Thompson beckoned to Nora. Come, child. You look like you have been dragged through a briar patch. Let us get you cleaned up. In the small kitchen, Mrs. Thompson poured warm water into a basin. Nora washed her face and hands, the grime of the storm swirling away. Mrs. Thompson handed her a towel. You have a hard road ahead, she said quietly. I know, Nora said. Don't let them shame you. Mrs. Thompson said fiercely. She gripped Nora's arm. I was a dance hall girl myself, 30 years ago in St. Louis. I know how people look at you. I know the names they call you. Nora looked at the older woman in surprise. I met Isaac, and we built a life. Mrs. Thompson continued. But there are still people who cross the street when I walk by. Let them walk. You know who you are. Do not let mean people define your worth. You are worth more than their judgment. Nora felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Thompson patted her cheek. Now go, and tell that cowboy of yours to shoot straight if he has to. The ride back to Dawn Creek was solemn. They carried the ledger and the letter wrapped in oilcloth in Eli's saddlebag. It felt heavier than gold. The landscape seemed to amplify the tension. The distant line of mountains stood like a gray wall between their past and their future. Every rock and shrub seemed to be holding its breath. They reached the outskirts of town just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the west, casting long, bruised shadows across the dirt. They did not sneak in. They rode down the center of the main street, side by side, their shoulders touching. The reaction was immediate. People stopped on the boardwalks. Heads turned. Whispers hissed through the air like steam. They came back. A woman gasped. Are they crazy? A man muttered. Silas will kill them. Look at them, another whispered. They are not running. Nora kept her back straight. She felt the eyes on her, the judgment, the curiosity, the malice. But she also felt Eli beside her. She felt the wooden bird in her pocket and the memory of Mrs. Thompson's words. You know who you are. They rode to the livery stable. Eli dismounted and helped Nora down. He handed the reins to the stable boy, who looked at them with wide, frightened eyes. Take care of them, Eli said, tossing the boy a coin. They walked to the blacksmith shop first. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named Jed, who had once shod horses for the same outfit Eli rode with, looked up from his anvil. You are walking into a fire. Carson, Jed said, wiping soot from his forehead. I know, Eli said. I need you to look at something. Jed, he showed him the ledger. He showed him the entries detailing bribes paid to the town council for contracts on ironwork that never happened. Jed's face darkened. He cheated me? He cheated everyone. Eli said. They went to the storekeeper, a quiet man named Miller, who was the cousin of the corrupt sheriff, but a man of different moral fiber. Eli showed him the proof of Silas inflating prices on goods brought in by freight. Slowly, quietly, they planted the seeds. They didn't shout. They just showed the paper. And as the sun went down, the mood in Dawn Creek began to shift. It wasn't a landslide, but the earth was moving. Nora spent the night in her old room at Mrs. Larkin's. Mrs. Larkin had let them in without a word. though her hands shook as she locked the front door. Eli stayed in the hallway, sitting on a chair with his gun in his lap, guarding her door. Nora did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the alley. She replayed every moment of her life that had led to this. The fear in her father's eyes, the smell of Silas's cologne, the jeering faces of the miners. She felt the old urge to curl inward, to make herself small, to disappear into the silence. It would be so easy to run again, to slip out the window and vanish. But then she closed her eyes and remembered the cabin. She remembered the heat of the fire and the strength of Eli's arms. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not as a possession, but as a treasure. "Hold me tight before dawn," she had pleaded. He had held her, and now she had to hold herself. She stood up and paced the small room. She practiced the words she would say. Her voice whispered in the darkness, shaky at first, then growing stronger. "I am not property. I am Nora." When dawn broke, she dressed in her cleanest dress. It was plain cotton, mended and worn, but she brushed it until it was neat. She pinned her hair back severely. She washed her face. She opened the door. Eli was standing there. He looked tired, his eyes rimmed with red, but he smiled when he saw her. "You ready?" he asked. Nora took a deep breath. Yes, the meeting was not planned, but it was inevitable. Word had spread that Eli and Nora were back and that they had evidence. By 8 in the morning, a crowd had gathered in the street in front of the sheriff's office. Silas Hargrove came out of the hotel, looking irritated but confident. He adjusted his silk tie and walked to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Miller was waiting, looking considerably less confident. "Disperse this crowd!" "Sheriff," Silas snapped. "I want those two arrested the moment they show their faces." "Here they come!" a boy shouted. Nora and Eli walked down the center of the street. They were not alone. Jed the blacksmith walked a few paces behind them, carrying his heavy hammer. Mr. Miller, the storekeeper, was there, along with a few ranch hands who respected Eli. The crowd parted to let them through. The air was thick with tension, smelling of dust and sweat. Silas stood on the boardwalk, looking down at them. He laughed, a short, barking sound. Well, the prodigal daughter returns, and she brought her guard dog. Did you run out of money already? Nora, did you realize you have nowhere else to go?" Nora stopped 10 feet from him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she planted her feet firmly in the dirt. "I did not come for money." "Silas," Nora said. Her voice was not loud, but in the silence of the street, it carried. Silas sneered. "Then why are you here? To beg for forgiveness? To work off your debt?" Eli stepped forward. He held up the leather-bound book. "We came to show the town this," Eli said. He opened the ledger. He held it up for the people in the front row to see. "This is Isaac Thompson's ledger," Eli announced. "It details 5 years of bribes paid by Silas Hargrove. Bribes to the sheriff, bribes to the land office. It shows how he forged contracts to steal land and how he cooked the books to cheat the merchants of this town." Silas's face went a shade paler, but he recovered quickly. "That is a fake, a forgery created by a desperate criminal. It is signed and sworn to by Isaac Thompson," Eli said calmly. "And we have a letter from him." He handed the letter to the storekeeper, who read it and nodded grimly to his neighbors. Silas laughed again, but it sounded brittle. "Who are you going to believe? Me, a man who has brought commerce and prosperity to this town? Or this piece of trash?" He pointed at Nora. "Look at her," Silas shouted. "She is a liar. She is a whore who seduced this gunman to do her bidding. She spread her legs for him just like she did for every miner with $1 back east." The words hit Nora like physical blows. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She saw the townspeople look at her, some with doubt, some with the old judgment. But this time, she did not look down. Nora stepped forward, moving out of Eli's shadow. She looked up at Silas. Her hands were trembling by her sides, but she lifted her chin. "You can call me names. Silas," Nora said. Her voice shook, but she pushed through the fear. "You can tell them lies about who I am, but you cannot change what you did." She turned to the crowd. She looked at the women who had shunned her. She looked at the men who had harassed her. "He forced me to sign that paper," she said. "I was 19. My father was dead. I had no money and no family. He told me if I didn't sign, I would go to prison for my father's debts. He used my fear against me." She took a breath, her voice gaining strength. "He made me wear those dresses. He made me sing those songs. And every night, he added to the debt. He charged me for the room, for the food, for the very air I breathed. He made sure I could never leave. He enslaved me, not with chains, but with ink and paper." The crowd was silent. They were listening. They were hearing the ring of truth in her desperation. "I am not a whore," Nora said, her voice ringing out now. "I am a woman who survived, and I am done being silent. I am done letting you own me." She pointed at the contract Silas was still holding. "That paper is a lie, and you are a thief of lives." Silas looked around. He saw the faces of the townspeople. They were not nodding with him anymore. They were looking at him with cold, hard eyes. The blacksmith gripped his hammer. The storekeeper folded his arms. Even the women were looking at Nora with a dawning realization. They recognized the story. It was the story of every powerful man who had ever used his position to crush someone smaller. The sheriff saw the tide turning. He took a half step away from Silas. "Arrest them!" Silas screamed, his composure shattering. "Sheriff, do your duty. Arrest this man for kidnapping. Arrest this woman for theft." The sheriff hesitated. He looked at Eli, who stood calm and ready. He looked at the angry crowd. I don't know. "Mr. Hargrove," the sheriff stammered. "If that ledger is real—" "You coward!" Silas spat. Silas reached into his coat. Eli moved instantly. "Nora, get back!" He shoved Nora behind him. Silas's hand came out with a Derringer pistol. At the same moment, the sheriff, panicked by the sudden movement, went for his own gun. Eli's hand hovered over his Colt. The air in the street seemed to freeze. The dust swirled around their boots in a sudden gust of wind. The smell of sweat and fear was pungent. Time stretched thin, every second lasting an hour. Nora, peeking from behind Eli's shoulder, saw the madness in Silas's eyes. He knew he was losing, and a man like Silas would burn the world down before he let it see him fail. The sun crested the building behind them, flooding the street with a blinding, pure light. It was the first hint of the new day. Hands hovered near weapons, hearts pounded in chests, and the silence that Nora had fought so hard to break was replaced by the deafening roar of impending violence. The snap of the Derringer was a small, mean sound, like a dry branch breaking, but it echoed against the false fronts of the buildings with the force of a cannon shot. Silas Hargrove had drawn first. He fired not with the steady hand of a duelist, but with the frantic, spasmodic jerk of a man watching his power evaporate. The bullet went wide, chipping a splinter of wood from the boardwalk post inches from Eli's head. Eli Carson did not flinch. His reaction was born of 1,000 terrible moments just like this one. He did not reach for his own gun immediately. His first instinct, honed by regret and love, was to save the woman standing beside him. He shoved Nora hard, sending her sprawling into the dust behind a rain barrel just as Silas thumbed the hammer for a second shot. "Stay down," Eli roared. He drew his Colt. The motion was fluid, a blur of motion that the eye could barely track. He fired a single shot, aiming not to kill, but to suppress. The bullet struck the dirt at Silas's feet, kicking up a spray of gravel that made the businessman dance back. Chaos erupted in the street. The crowd, which had been pressing forward only moments before, scattered like quail. Women screamed and dragged their children into the general store. Men dove behind horse troughs and hitching rails, the air filled with the sharp, acrid scent of burnt gunpowder. Sheriff Miller, caught in the crossfire of his own making, shouted something unintelligible. He waved his hands, his face pale as milk, terrified by the violence he had allowed to fester. He made no move to draw his weapon, paralyzed by the realization that he had backed a man who was now trying to murder civilians in broad daylight. Silas fired again. This time, his aim was truer. Eli felt a sudden, searing heat along his left side, just above the hip. It felt as if a hot poker had been dragged across his ribs. The impact staggered him, his boots slipping in the loose dirt. He gritted his teeth, forcing the pain into a corner of his mind. He could not fall. Not now. If he fell, Silas would kill Nora. Eli returned fire, his bullet shattering the window of the sheriff's office behind Silas. Glass rained down, sparkling in the sun. "Stop it!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking. "Kill him! Sheriff, he's shooting at me, from behind the water barrel." Nora Gallagher pressed her face into the dirt. The noise was deafening. Every crack of a pistol shot made her heart stop. She could smell the dust, the horse manure, and the metallic tang of fear. She wanted to stay hidden. She wanted to curl into a ball and wait for the silence. But then she heard Eli grunt in pain. Something inside Nora snapped. It was the tether that had held her to her past, the chain of silence she had worn for 2 years. She realized, with a clarity that was colder and harder than diamond, that Silas did not just want to own her, he wanted to erase her. He wanted to kill the truth, because it was the only thing he could not buy. She scrambled to her knees. She did not have a gun. She had only her voice, the voice he had tried to steal. "He is trying to kill us," Nora shouted. Her voice cut through the panic, shrill and desperate. She stood up behind the barrel, exposing herself to the street. "He is trying to kill us because we know the truth. Look at him. He is not a businessman. He is a murderer." The men who had ducked into doorways looked out. They saw Silas, his face twisted into a mask of pure, animal rage, reloading his small pistol with shaking hands. They saw Eli, bleeding from his side, standing his ground to protect the girl. Silas snapped the derringer shut and raised it, aiming not at Eli, but at the barrel where Nora stood. "I will end you, you ungrateful little—" A deafening boom shook the street, louder than the pistols. Jed the blacksmith stood by the livery stable. A heavy buffalo rifle smoked in his hands. He had fired into the air, the sound rolling like thunder. "Drop it, Hargrove!" Jed bellowed. His voice was like grinding stones. "This ends now." Silas flinched, his attention wavering for a fraction of a second. It was all Eli needed. He ignored the fire in his side and surged forward. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He brought the barrel of his Colt down in a chopping motion, striking Silas's wrist. Silas screamed as the derringer clattered to the dirt. But Silas was a desperate man, and desperate men are dangerous. With his gun gone, he lunged forward, grabbing the only shield he had left. He seized Nora by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with bruising force, and yanked her out from behind the barrel. He dragged her against his chest, wrapping a forearm around her throat. He used her body to block Eli's line of fire. "Back off!" Silas shrieked, spitting saliva. "Back off or I break her neck!" Nora felt the familiar terror rise, a black tide threatening to drown her. The smell of his cologne, mixed now with sweat and fear, triggered a memory of the saloon, of the nights she had been trapped in his office. She felt small. She felt owned. No, the thought was a spark. "I am not his." She felt his grip on her arm. She felt his injured shoulder, the one he had favored even back east after a carriage accident. She knew his weakness. She did not freeze. She did not beg. Nora slammed the heel of her boot down onto Silas's instep with all her strength. At the same moment, she twisted her body, driving her elbow backward into his bad shoulder. Silas howled in pain. His grip loosened just enough. Nora tore herself free. She shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward into the dirt. Silas tried to scramble up, clawing for the derringer in the dust. A boot slammed down on his hand. Eli stood over him. He was pale, his shirt dark with blood at the waist, but his gun was steady, aimed directly at the center of Silas's forehead. "Stay down," Eli rasped. "Do not give me a reason." Silas froze. He looked up into the barrel of the Colt, and then into Eli's eyes. He saw no mercy there. He saw only a finality that terrified him more than death. He slumped back into the dust, defeated. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. Sheriff Miller, seeing his patron on the ground, tried to slip quietly toward the alleyway, hoping to disappear before the town remembered he was there. "Where do you think you are going?" Miller? It was Mr. Miller, the storekeeper, no relation, but a man of much sterner stuff. He stepped into the sheriff's path, crossing his arms. The sheriff halted. Now, wait a minute. I was going to get the shackles to arrest him. A murmur went through the crowd. It started low and grew into a shout. You stood there and watched. A woman cried. You took his money, Jed the blacksmith shouted. Stepping into the street, the townspeople surged forward. They surrounded the sheriff and Silas. The fear had broken, replaced by a righteous anger. They had been played for fools, and they were done with it. They did not hang them. Dawn Creek was a rough town, but on this day, they chose law over lynching. A traveling circuit judge, a stern man named Judge Abernathy, who had arrived on the stagecoach 2 days prior and had been delayed by the storm, took charge of the proceedings. He held court in the main room of the saloon, the very place where Silas had tried to ruin Nora's name. The ledger was read aloud. Every bribe, every forged deed, every twisted contract was brought into the light. Isaac Thompson's letter was read, his testimony damning. Nora sat in the front row. Her hands were folded in her lap. She watched Silas as the evidence was read. He did not look at her. He sat slumped in his chair, stripped of his power, looking small and old. When called to testify, Nora stood. She did not need to shout now. The room was so quiet that the buzzing of a fly against the window pane sounded loud. She told her story again. She spoke of the contract, the coercion, the theft of her life. I am not asking for pity, Nora said, her voice steady. I am asking for my name back. And I am asking that no other girl has to sign her life away to a man like him. Judge Abernathy struck his gavel. The sound was final. Silas Hargrove's assets in the territory were seized. The contract was declared null and void, an instrument of illegal coercion. He was ordered to be transported to the territorial capital to face charges of fraud, assault, and attempted murder. Sheriff Miller was stripped of his badge on the spot. He was given until sundown to leave Dawn Creek and never return. It was over. The weight of the paper, the weight of the debt, the weight of the past, it was all lifted. Nora turned to look for Eli. She wanted to share this moment. She wanted to see his eyes. Eli was standing near the door, leaning heavily against the frame. His face was the color of old ash. As their eyes met, he tried to smile, but his knees buckled. Eli! Nora scrambled over the chair, rushing to him. Eli slid down the door frame, collapsing onto the floor. His coat fell open, revealing his shirt soaked red from hip to ribs. The adrenaline that had kept him standing had finally run dry. Nora fell to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands against the wound, the warm blood seeping through her fingers. "Someone get the doctor!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "Help him!" Eli looked up at her. His eyes were unfocused, glassy with shock. Did we win?" he whispered. "Yes," Nora sobbed, brushing the hair from his damp forehead. "Yes, Eli, we won. You have to stay with me. You promised. I am tired. Nora, stay with me," Nora commanded, gripping his hand. "Don't you dare leave me now." The blacksmith and the storekeeper lifted Eli gently, carrying him out of the saloon toward the boarding house. Nora ran beside them, holding his hand, her heart breaking with every step. The days that followed were a blur of lamplight and shadows. Eli lay in the best room of the boarding house. The doctor, a man who had dug more bullets out of cowboys than he cared to count, said the bullet had broken a rib and torn through muscle, but missed the lung. The danger now was fever. Nora did not leave his side. She slept in a chair by the bed. She wiped his brow with cool cloths. She spooned broth into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his head. The fever came on the third night. Eli tossed and turned, his skin burning to the touch. He mumbled in his sleep, trapped in the nightmares of his past. "I didn't mean to," he groaned, clutching the sheets. "The boy, he had a gun. I didn't want to—" Nora leaned close, whispering in his ear, "Shh. Eli, it is over. You are safe. I am sorry." He wept in his delirium. "I am so sorry. I don't deserve. I am a butcher." Nora took his face in her hands. She forced him to look at her, even though his eyes were wild and unseeing. "Listen to me, Eli Carson," she said fiercely. "You are not a butcher. You are the man who saved me. I have killed." "You saved me," Nora repeated. "You saved me not by using your gun, but by seeing me. When the whole world saw a thing to be used, you saw a person. That is who you are. That is the man I love." The words hung in the quiet room. It was the first time she had said it. Eli's breathing hitched. He seemed to hear her through the fog. His thrashing stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and a single tear tracked through the sweat on his cheek. "Nora?" he whispered. "I am here," she said. "I am right here." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, his sleep was peaceful. Recovery was slow, measured in the changing light of the seasons. The spring turned into early summer. The snow on the mountains began to melt, feeding the creeks. As Eli's strength returned, the world began to open up again. He sat on the porch, watching the town go about its business. Dawn Creek was not a paradise. There were still people who crossed the street to avoid them. There were still women who pulled their skirts aside when Nora walked by, unable to let go of their prejudice, but there were cracks in the ice. When Nora went to the general store, Mr. Miller gave her a discount on flour, a small thing, but a kindness. When Eli walked to the barber for a shave, the men in the chairs nodded to him with respect. They didn't see a killer anymore. They saw a man who had stood his ground for a woman. Mrs. Thompson rode into town one Sunday and sat next to Nora in the back of the small church. It was a silent declaration that shamed the gossips into silence. Nora and Eli began to talk about the future. They sat on the porch in the long, golden evenings, watching the sun set. "I can't stay here," Eli said one evening. "Too many eyes, too much history. I know." Nora said, "I feel it too. I know a valley." Eli said, "About 2 days' ride west. It is high up. The winters are hard, and the ground is rocky, but there is water, and there is timber." Nora looked at him. "Can we build a house?" Eli smiled. It was a real smile now, one that reached his eyes. "We can build anything we want." They made their plans. They bought supplies. They bought 2 sturdy pack mules. They prepared to leave the town that had been their prison and their battleground on their last morning, before the sun had risen. Nora walked to the edge of town where the stagecoach station stood. She looked at the spot where she'd stepped off the coach months ago. She remembered the girl she had been, terrified, clutching her carpet bag, swallowing her voice. She remembered the crushing weight of her own shame. She stood there in the gray light and spoke to that ghost. "You survived," Nora whispered. "You did well, but I don't need you anymore." She turned her back on the station. She walked back toward the boarding house, her step light, her head high. She was not Nora the victim. She was not Nora the property. She was just Nora. The air was cold and smelled of pine and damp earth. The sky to the east was just beginning to bruise with the promise of dawn, turning from black to a deep, resonant violet. The horses were packed and ready. Eli stood by his bay, checking the girth one last time. He moved a little stiffly still, favoring his left side. But he was strong. He wore a new shirt Nora had made for him. Nora came out of the boarding house. She wore a riding skirt and a sturdy coat. She carried no carpet bag this time. Her hands were free. Eli looked up as she approached. He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her with a quiet, profound awe. He saw the scars she carried, invisible but deep, and he saw the strength that had grown over them. "You ready to ride?" he asked. Nora nodded. She walked up to her horse and mounted. She sat tall in the saddle. Eli swung up onto his horse. He gathered the reins. They looked at the town one last time. It was quiet, sleeping. It would wake up and go on without them. The gossip would fade. The story of the gunman and the girl would become a legend, distorted by time until it was just another tall tale of the West. But it wasn't a tale to them. It was their life. Eli looked at Nora. Nora leaned slightly toward him in the saddle. Eli reached out. His hand. warm and rough, covered hers. He squeezed it, a silent language of reassurance. "I am with you," his touch said. "I am with you," her hand answered. They turned their horses toward the west, toward the valley and the mountains and the hard work of building a life. As they rode out of Dawn Creek, the sun finally crested the horizon. The first rays of light hit the land, turning the gray dust to gold. It washed over them, warm and blinding. They did not look back. They rode into the vast, open landscape, two small figures against the enormity of the world. They carried their scars, and they carried their memories, but they also carried a love that had been forged in the dark, in the silence, and in the storm. And as the dawn broke fully around them, they knew that whatever the world threw at them next, they would not face it alone. They would face it together. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Nora and Eli touched your heart as much as it did mine. It is a story about the power of standing up for the truth and how love can be found even in the darkest of silences. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below telling me your country or city. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel From Wild West. We have many more stories of the frontier, of romance, and of adventure waiting for you. And finally, please share your thoughts on the story in the comments in English. Did you like the ending? What was your favorite part? I read every comment and would love to hear from you. Until next time, keep the spirit of the West alive.